Hey folks, in this video we're going to be covering neuroanatomy from chapter 3 of our textbook, particularly getting into different parts of the brain and how it's organized. So first things first, we need to be able to describe the directions of things in your brain in terms of where they are. And the reason we need to do that is because sometimes when neuroanatomists look at the brain, they're looking at it in the typical direction that we see, but sometimes it's upside down. Sometimes it's they're looking at it from the back. And so standard language like up top and toward the front and left and right tend to get a little confusing in those kinds of circumstances. And so we've got some standard language here that we need to learn that always refers to the same location. Okay, and so one big differentiation is dorsal versus ventral. Dorsal is a bit like the dorsal fin on a dolphin. See here, sort of kind of up on the top of the brain. You'll see that this is also on your back. Imagine yourself sort of on all fours, and that makes sense. So the dorsal side is the back here, but also the top of the brain. So this part of the brain is always going to be dorsal or more dorsal than other areas. Compare that to ventral. Ventral is the opposite of dorsal. In this case, it's on the bottom of the brain when you're looking at it right side up. The other differentiation is anterior versus posterior. Anterior is in the front in this case, and posterior is in the back. And that's how it's typically going to be, but you'll see this will always refer to the same locations of the brain, regardless of which direction you're looking at it. The other differentiation, the third and final differentiation, is medial versus lateral. So medial means that something is toward the middle, and lateral is toward the outside. Now, you can combine these things together when describing parts of the brain. So, for example, somebody might say dorsolateral. Now, that's going to mean that it's toward the dorsal part of the brain, right? Toward the top of your skull here, but also toward the outside. So, it's going to be toward the top of the skull and toward the outside, as compared to dorsomedial, which will be toward the top, but toward the inside of the brain. The other thing you're going to see is that sometimes we don't see that brain from the outside. Sometimes we want to see the interior structures. And when we do that, what we're going to see is these planes being cut through the brain to see it from different views. So if you want to see the brain from the top, you can take a superior view, a horizontal plane like this. You could slice right through it like this and see the structures from the top. Somewhat more common are the frontal planes and sagittal planes like this, where you can see the interior of the brain either from the front or from the side. This allows you to see things like the corpus callosum here, right, the inside structures of the brain that would otherwise not be viewable from the outside. Final thing to talk about in this video is the different general structures of the brain. And your book breaks this down into 5 parts. But in general, I mostly want you to understand the 3 parts. Okay? So you've got the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain and the midbrain here are eventually going to make up your most of your brain stem. But all of this is going to be coming off of the spinal cord. The reason that this is separated out into these 3 sections is based on early brain development. So as your brain starts to differentiate from the spinal cord in your central nervous system, you're going to see that we expand upon that spinal cord with new brain matter into these 3 sections. The first one here is the hindbrain, the most basic, then the midbrain, a little bit more complex, and then the forebrain, which will eventually develop quite a bit more. You'll see over here on the right side. And eventually, these 3 general structures, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain, are going to look like this at the end of development. And you'll see that what started as 3 relatively similar sized structures and for some animals remain relatively similar sized. For humans, our forebrain in particular expands quite a bit and leads to this structure called the cerebrum, often referred to as the cerebrum, but it is otherwise known as the forebrain. So all of this structure right here is the forebrain, is typically what you see when you see pictures of the brain. It's oftentimes what we're talking about when we talk about complex psychological functions. But don't forget that we still have the midbrain that stays relatively small, and then the hindbrain here, which expands a bit for general purposes. Okay, we'll walk through what each of these sections do in the following video.